Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gail Laila, and I am presenting today on the Township of Galloway's Advanced Microgrid project. The Township of Galloway is a really interesting municipality located in Atlantic County, which is actually one of the largest municipalities in the state of New Jersey, with an area of 115 square miles. The town is home to several major critical uses and needs for not just Atlantic County, but also for the state of New Jersey. We want to take a step back and actually talk about how we got to the Township of Galloway for creating a master plan, an energy master plan for designing a microgrid. We began this journey back in 2016 when we began to work with the Board of Public Utilities in highlighting what are pilot communities that we can observe have a critical need and really represent different types of populations, different types of demographics and geographic areas. Galloway is unique because it sits within a receiving area called the Pinelands, and it has an interesting diversity of critical facilities that leverages proximity for central locations. It serves the Atlantic City area. It also serves healthcare, senior care, education, and we'll go more into detail about that. But primarily, it's home to 40,000 people. It has grown about 19% over the last 10 years alone. It's home to the FAA Tech Center, Stockton University, and some tourist attractions such as the Seaview Hotel. And many small businesses are supported in this area. So we thought this municipality would be a prime pilot opportunity to observe the creation of a town center advanced microgrid and working with several stakeholders. So the anchor site that we wanted to study for the Township of Galloway is the Atlantic Care Regional Medical Center, which is at 65 West Jimmy Leeds Road. It's actually within the jurisdiction of Pomona, but we decided to include it in our cluster as the major focal point because it's labeled as a Tier 4 FEMA critical facility, which is actually the highest level of criticality. It has a large energy and thermal load, and it's adjacent to assisted living centers that are crucial for having a shelter-in-place strategy. But because Galloway is so large in terms of its spread, as you'll see on the map that's displayed, we opted to include critical facilities that were usually not more than a half a mile away from this anchor site. So you'll see that displayed in this map here. Okay, so what are the unique challenges that we have observed here? Spatial. The distance between these critical facilities, which we will list out shortly, present interesting physical challenges for planners, engineers, and facility managers. That doesn't mean that it isn't feasible. It just means that we have to have a precise review of feasibility for looking at strategic ways that we can look at underground conduit or capital projects that are already underway. For instance, just to backtrack, Jimmy Leeds Road is probably one of the most primary roads that is a main thoroughfare for citizens and those that are attending the school district and the hospital. If there's a capital plan that's in place for digging up that road, repaving, we want to look at that project because it represents a way that we might be able to redesign how it is taken into effect. If it can be upgraded to include underground conduit for the microgrid. The Pine Barrens also presents an additional physical barrier The Pinelands area is a strategic area for looking at the preservation of land use and open space. So we want to keep that in mind and work with the Pinelands as a strategic partner in understanding how we can best preserve strategic land uses there. The second unique challenge is the coordination of looking at underground cable and coordinated nodes. Any planned infrastructure, as we mentioned, repairs that could reduce infrastructure costs so that we're not looking at repeatedly putting overhead wires that are going to be damaged during potential future nor'easters. Actually, today is the first day of the hurricane storm season, so it's notable as of today to observe the ways we can look at underground conduit versus overhead cabling, and what are the costs per square mile that would cost. Geographic information. The proximity to the Atlantic Ocean leaves the municipality quite vulnerable to extreme weather events and flooding. We observed within the last 3 nor'easters here in New Jersey that there were some effects on the electrical distribution side, but they were actually quite fortunate not to have severe blackouts during the last 3 months or the last 3 nor'easters. This cluster is actually directly adjacent to the Garden State Parkway. That's actually really notable because this is a critical artery for the state for evacuation, public services during times of emergency. So the municipality has been very keen on working with the state as a strategic partner for looking at Office of Emergency Management operations that are going to be needed. A high number of critical facilities, especially medical, educational, and municipal. As you'll see here, we have a cluster of middle schools. We have Absegami High School. We actually have a great cluster of assisted living centers, which have to be treated as a shelter in place for that population. And to the right corner of your screen, you'll see that Town Hall and the police station is within this close cluster, which it acts as a great campus for the hub of OEM and communications operations, and for fielding things that might be needed also by the state. All right. And once again, we mentioned that there's a critical need to observe evacuation routes, coastal evacuation routes in particular, as there are several different roadways that will be utilized by OEM, police, fire, and emergency management staff for responding to emergency situations, as you'll see in this next slide. Now let's get into the features of a critical facility and the data that we're looking at. What our team did was we observed what are the most critical needs when we want to build out a backup energy system, a microgrid. 1, educational. Stockton University, the elementary school district, the middle school and the high school are all great participants, great stakeholders that have observed what happens in the event of a power failure, or maybe it's a short blip of energy that's lost. They've already begun to look at energy efficiency, geothermal, solar, and are now looking at these next steps to make sure that those distributed energy resources are being harnessed and can be used in the event of an overall distribution power failure. The next category is inpatient, looking at the Seashore Gardens Living Center, looking at any nursing home rehabilitation center that the population cannot necessarily be moved to another critical facility outside of the jurisdiction of Galloway. It's really keen that we observe what are their critical uses, what are the emergency power needs and loads that must be in place, such as air conditioning during the summer months and heating for critical needs, as inpatient and treatment are a must during critical times. The third category is healthcare. Of course, we mentioned Atlantic Care Regional Medical Center. The fourth is actually food sales and pharmaceutical needs. We're observing that there is a Wakefern ShopRite, which could serve as a critical facility for serving the population and maybe the broader area of Atlantic County, depending on the use of backup refrigeration and other energy resources for heating and cooling. And not to be named last, but public order and safety, with Galloway Town Hall being the most principal site for government use in communications and safety. These are the overall facilities and the methodology that we came up with to decide what is a critical need for the Township of Galloway. The next area that we looked at was Socio-Economic Data. The population as of 2016 was around 40,000. There is quite a number of single-family homes of about 14,000, so we keep that in mind, whether they're in a cluster or whether there's more of a sprawl. Retail sales are around 6,000. That's something to also observe. What are the potential revenue losses during the event of a storm failure? So that 6,000 could be actually under certain circumstances of power failures that could impact the local economy greatly. Say if the food, retail, pharmaceutical companies that are there, even a coffee shop, they're all burdened by power failure. And lastly, what we looked at was population per square mile, which is at 420. So that is also a key, these are key statistics to look at when planning for a microgrid. Next is the way we conducted the town center analysis. Now, there are various definitions of a backup energy system, a microgrid. There could be a campus, there could be a military style microgrid, but in particular, we're observing a town center microgrid. So for this, we would look at energy consumption, buildings with high annual electric kilowatts per hour, thermal usage, and high peak electricity demand. So just to back up, what is peak? What is peak energy? Typically, it's the point of the day, it could be 15 minutes in a single day that you're paying the most for your electricity and your gas. And so it's very notable to keep that in mind, because a microgrid can actually be used to offset those costs in the event of, say, instead of using a peaker plant or another sort of way to supply energy, you can actually look at ways, whether it be battery storage, a generator, and other distributed energy resources to reduce those costs during those peak times that are typically the most expensive. Here in New Jersey, that time is usually around 2 p.m. when kids are coming home from school. California is turned on with all of their power. Wall Street is in high activity. Who knows, even with Bitcoin, there's a lot of different uses that are happening around that time of day. So it's very interesting to observe when those costs fluctuate in energy. The next slide that we have here is energy consumption data. So for the facilities, we have about 10 critical facilities that we have pulled down square footage, their annual energy usage, and this is both within kilowatt hours in electricity and therms for gas usage. So lastly, Galloway, because of its uniqueness in the spread of facilities, can actually be broken up into multiple clusters. You'll see the distance here on this map, that we wanted to include everything that we could that was considered critical for the overall master plan of designing a backup energy system, a town center microgrid. But we observed that it's going to be more strategic to evaluate groupings of facilities that make sense, that have the right thermal mix, the right off-take arrangements, and can become ideal project partners. So theoretically, we can look at the school district everywhere from middle school to the high school as one cluster, and then also looking at town hall, police, assisted living, and the hospital and rehabilitation center as perhaps another cluster. And that all gets decided upon in a engineering design exercise by looking at the cost of distribution, the cost of placing conduit in the roads, and the cost of placing generation, whether it be upgrading geothermal, upgrading battery storage, cogeneration. We look at all of these technologies and we identify what is the right mix for multiple groupings of facilities that must include these critical needs. So that pretty much sums up the Galloway Township Advanced Microgrid concepts. And we hope that this project has continued great success in working with the community and becomes a showcase pilot site for a town center that can be within the distribution area of the Atlantic City Electric and South Jersey Gas. Thank you for your time.